January 17th, 1991, Tel Aviv, Israel. As the US-led coalition of Western and Arab nations fight to oust Saddam Hussein's Iraq from Kuwait, Israel sits on the sidelines, knowing its intervention could weaken Arab support for Operation Desert Storm. Now, however, the war has come to the small Jewish state as air raid sirens ring out over the city, signaling an attack is underway. That attack comes in the form of the dreaded Scud missiles fired from the Iraqi military, and with no warning of when and where they will land, the entire city braces itself for the inevitable. Saddam wants Israel to strike back, knowing it will damage the coalition's cohesion, but instead, US Patriot surface-to-air missiles are deployed to intercept them, while American, British, and French special forces go deep behind Iraqi lines to destroy their launchers, actions which temper Israeli anger. This was perhaps the most famous use of the Scud missile in combat, but it was by no means the first time this simple but deadly ballistic missile had been fired in anger. Far from it. It was not even the first time Israelis had come under fire from the weapon. Egyptian forces had launched a small number against them in 1973, while Iraq also fired numbers against Iran during the bitter 8-year-long war between the two countries during the 1980s. And yet, perhaps this weapon's most significant use in a conflict is probably the most overlooked. For as Afghanistan descended into civil war during the late 1980s and early 1990s, thousands of these weapons were used to combat factions vying for power over the mountainous, rugged land. It is somewhat jarring to consider that a country whose population's way of life had changed so little for thousands of years should find itself using a weapon designed with the technology employed in the early space race. But not only that, they would become the subject of the most sustained ballistic missile campaign since the V-2 rocket attacks on London in World War II. This is the story of Afghanistan's forgotten Scud War. Welcome to Wars of the World. To the victor go the spoils of war, and in the aftermath of World War II, the one thing the victorious Allied powers wanted from Germany was their various advanced technologies that the brilliant yet twisted minds of Nazi scientists had conceived of to satisfy Hitler's despicable dreams. With the Eastern and Western allies already eyeing one another suspiciously, even before the war ended, there was a rush to gather as much technology as possible before their former allies could take it for themselves. One Nazi weapon that had proven totally unstoppable during the closing stages of the war was the V-2 rockets, 1,115 of which had been fired at the United Kingdom, and in particular against the capital city London, killing 2,754 people and striking terror into the heart of the population. By this late stage in the war, not even this wonder weapon could reverse the fortunes of Hitler's Germany, but it was clear to all that as a weapons system, the V-2 was an immature design, and with further research could become a truly terrible weapon, particularly with the advent of nuclear warheads. V-2 research was captured by the Soviet Union and then improved upon, which led to a series of more reliable and more powerful versions of the V-2, some of which were reportedly observed flying over Sweden during tests in the late 1940s. Later, the technologies that emerged from these tests produced the R-11 missile, developed by Soviet engineer Viktor Makiyev, under the guidance of Sergei Korolev, who would become a leading figure in the Soviet space program. The missile was smaller than the V-2, adopting a pencil-like fuselage as opposed to the cigar-shaped German weapon. But the advance in technologies meant that its performance was still comparable and was generally more accurate and reliable. First flying on April 18, 1953, the liquid-fueled rocket was quickly ordered into production for use by the Soviet forces to attack NATO staging areas in Western Europe from behind Soviet lines, with conventional or nuclear warheads on day one of World War III. Given the large, primitive nuclear warheads employed by the Soviets, the weapon's range was limited to 93 miles, or 150 kilometers, when in nuclear mode. Carried on the chassis of a converted IS-2 tank, they could be run up to the front line and concealed in towns or in woodlands during times of crisis, waiting for the order for them to be erected and fired at their targets. Since the Soviets liked to keep the designations for their weapons a secret as much as possible, upon sighting these new missiles being deployed, NATO decided to assign them the codename Scud, and it would be this name the weapon would be most known by. Research into rocketry for both defense and to support the space program meant that very quickly the technology advanced even further, rendering the R-11 obsolete. McKeeve therefore worked on improving his design, and this resulted in the R-17, known to NATO as the Scud B. Range was nearly doubled over the earlier weapon, with it now reaching 186 miles, and featuring a host of mechanical improvements, leading to the Scud B becoming the most prolific version of the weapon, with over 7,000 missiles being produced. Furthermore, it was a much more versatile weapon, being capable of handling various different warhead types, not just conventional or nuclear ones, these including fragmentation or even chemical weapons for attacking large gatherings of troops, or, if necessary, population centers. Despite further improvements to the weapon, the Scuds were soon falling out of favor with the Soviet military, who began fielding more advanced designs. However, being inferior to Soviet weapons made it ideal politically to export to Soviet client states. Egypt, Iraq, and Libya were particularly eager to get their hands on Scuds, believing their performance would help counter the technological edge of potential adversaries, such as Israel, Iran, and the US, respectively. Egypt would be the first to fire them in anger, launching 3 at Israeli forces on October 22, 1973, followed by Iraq, who used them extensively against Iran and produced their own longer-ranged but much less accurate version. Libya, meanwhile, rather boldly attempted to use them to destroy the US Coast Guard station on the Italian island of Lampedusa, although the weapons fired missed their target. The Scud thus became something of an entry-level ballistic missile system, being relatively cheap and easy to use and relatively available. While its performance was seldom as hoped for by the countries buying them up, their psychological impact in the wars they fought far exceeded their practical impact, and it would be this factor especially that would be of great use in Central Asia and the fighting taking place in Afghanistan. Often considered the Soviet Union's Vietnam, the Red Army's invasion of Afghanistan on December 24, 1979, and the decade-long conflict that followed was one of a number of events during the 1980s that chipped away at the communist superpower, bringing about its eventual demise. Having prepared for 40 years to face NATO in a bloody conventional war in Western Europe, the Red Army, comprising primarily of conscripts drawn from rural areas with little knowledge of the outside world, struggled to fight the guerrilla tactics of the Mujahideen, the Islamic Soldiers of God, opposed to the pro-Soviet Afghan government in Kabul, whose cultural reforms flew in the face of their Islamic laws and traditions. Supported by Western intelligence agencies determined to see the Soviets fail in their goals in the country, and bolstered by Islamic fighters from all over the world eager to join in the jihad against the non-believers, the Mujahideen conducted a successful campaign using their intimate knowledge of Afghanistan's rugged terrain to set ambushes and carry out raids. With no discernible front line to demonstrate their fortunes, only bodies being sent back to the Soviet Union, along with demoralized conscripts once their term was up. By the late 1980s, there were calls to end Soviet involvement in the conflict as quickly as possible, especially as the Soviet Union was, by then, showing signs of collapse. However, the Soviet leadership was acutely aware that it couldn't simply withdraw, leaving the Afghan communist government to fend for itself against the CIA-backed Mujahideen. Not only would this damage Soviet prestige and weaken its influence on the world stage, but it also left open the possibility of a pro-US faction seizing power in the country, opening Afghanistan up to supporting Washington's own goals in the region. Therefore, rather than a simple withdrawal, the Soviets instigated a policy of transferring greater responsibility for military operations against the Mujahideen to the Afghan army, echoing the US policy of Vietnamization towards the end of the Vietnam War, and eerily foreshadowing the future NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan. Soviet troops therefore formulated and implemented an intense training program for their Afghan counterparts, and began providing them with ever more advanced equipment, such as MiG-27 ground attack aircraft. However, one weapon that few expected to be thrown into the arena at this time was the Scud ballistic missile system. While many Western observers were puzzled by the transfer of Scuds, wondering what use they would be in a guerrilla war, across the border in Pakistan, their arrival was met with considerable alarm. Pakistan having been a conduit for much of the support to the Mujahideen and housing up to 3 million Afghans displaced by years of fighting, many of whom were hostile to the communist government. The fear was that they would start sending these Scuds over the border into Pakistan to attack their opponents in hiding there. The first strikes involved Scud Bs being used to target Mujahideen ammunition drops near the Pakistani border and against fortified positions, the hope being to spare the Afghan army from any unnecessary grisly ground battles. However, the inaccuracy of the Scuds continued to be a problem, save for when targeting the biggest Mujahideen camps or towns under their control. Even under the best of circumstances, the weapon could be as inaccurate as half a kilometer from its aim points. Fine if you are delivering a nuke onto a target, but with a fairly small conventional warhead in the region of 1,000 kilograms, luck was often the deciding factor in success. However, the psychological impact the missiles had was immense. These weapons, capable of reaching speeds of Mach 5, struck from out of nowhere and were impossible to stop once they had been fired, and as their use intensified, so too did their reputation, even if that reputation wasn't wholly deserved. With the Soviets now fully geared up to withdraw, the Mujahideen began to splinter into factions, all vying for power. But using the reputation of the unstoppable Scuds, the communist government was on several occasions able to settle several disputes peacefully by threatening to unleash these weapons. In one instance, bandits manning a roadblock were warned that they would be hit by a Scud if they didn't abandon their position. Within hours, they were gone. Unfortunately for the communist leadership in Afghanistan, not all of their enemies could be so easily dissuaded by the mere threat of Scuds, and so, with the help of the remaining Soviet advisors, the 99th Missile Brigade began to dramatically increase the tempo of their operations in early 1989. In March of that year, spurred on by Pakistani Inter-Service Intelligence, or ISI, two prominent Mujahideen factions attacked the government-held eastern city of Jalalabad. Situated approximately 80 miles or 130 kilometers east of Kabul, the Mujahideen attacked the city in the first major offensive since the withdrawal of the Soviet troops. However, the fighting became bogged down by tougher-than-expected government resistance, leading to the city being laid siege to. As a part of the efforts to lift the siege, the 99th would fire some 438 Scuds at concentrations of hostile fighters, their entrenched positions and their supply lines, in what was the most concentrated ballistic missile barrage since the V2s against London. During the campaign, on April 7th, 1989, one Scud missed its target and strayed into Pakistani territory, striking near the main road that ran from Jalalabad to Peshawar in Pakistan, while another landed in Pakistan on May 22nd, and while no one was killed, it only further rattled Pakistani authorities regarding the weapons use by the Afghan army. Scuds were also used to help clear out Mujahideen fighters from the overrun army base at Samarkand, 15 miles southeast of the city. The siege would come to an end in June of 1989, with an Afghan government victory, something that Soviet government sources stated was greatly aided by the power of the Scuds. As a result, the Afghan government demanded more missiles from Moscow, who continued to provide scores of them for use against the various factions that were increasingly fighting amongst themselves in what was now a bloody civil war. For the ailing Soviet economy, this support was rather expensive, with each missile valued at $1 million each, over $2.3 million today. By October of 1989, 995 Scuds had been launched by the Afghan army, but they could do little to help end the fighting, which was spilling into every corner of the country. With the Soviets seemingly having insurmountable problems of their own, the extensive military aid that Afghanistan had been receiving began to dramatically fall off, with everyone in Moscow recognizing that Afghanistan was a lost cause and wanting to distance themselves from it as much as possible, especially as the Western intelligence agencies also began to do the same thing regarding the Mujahideen. Nevertheless, despite having peaked, the 99th Missile Brigade continued operations into 1990, putting Kabul increasingly at odds with Pakistan. On November 12, 1990, the Afghanistan government claimed 2 Pakistani warplanes violated Afghan airspace, but Islamabad rejected this claim. Less than a week later, on November 20th, 1990, a Scud missile fired from Kabul landed in the Khyber Agency of Pakistan, damaging 3 houses. A week after that, 2 Scuds were fired into the Teri Mangal area in the Kurram Agency, killing 11 people, including 3 Afghan refugees, and injuring 15 others, as well as destroying 4 vehicles. Pakistan voiced their protests at the UN, but with nobody seemingly prepared to do anything significant to help, particularly as the Security Council was largely distracted by Iraq's recent invasion of Kuwait. Pakistan turned to China and even North Korea for assistance in building their own ballistic missile force to counter Kabul's weapons, as well as their old enemy India, which was also undertaking a missile program. Further Scud attacks came throughout 1991, aiming to quell insurrections in various parts of Afghanistan. By May of that year, Kabul had fired nearly 1,554 Scud Bs in support of their war against the various factions, but the writing was seemingly on the wall for their government. Throughout the remainder of 1991, as they increasingly lost control of swathes of land, the number of Scud launches dropped down to a trickle. Afghanistan's leader Najibullah managed to hold on to power until March of 1992, after which he had no choice but to step down. The following month, on April 24th, the base at Afshar was captured by forces loyal to Ahmad Shah Massoud, putting an end to the 99th Missile Brigade and affording the Mujahideen leader a stockpile of 50 missiles and a number of vehicles, albeit with no way of launching them, as the former members of the 99th discarded their uniforms and attempted to hide amongst the population from the new leaders of Afghanistan. While unable to use them as intended, the factions that managed to capture the Scuds, either from the Afghan army or even from each other as the infighting continued, saw them as status symbols and frequently paraded them in towns and cities under their control. Then, on October 12, 1992, a Scud armed vehicle in South Kabul was attacked by fighters whose loyalties remain unknown, although at the time it was suspected to be one of the last remnants of Afghan's government forces, damaging the vehicle and rocket beyond repair in an effort to prevent its new owners from ever using it. The fall of Najibullah's communist government didn't see a total end to the use of Scud missiles in Afghanistan. Members of the 99th Missile Brigade, who either switched sides or were coerced into cooperation, helped launch missiles on nearly 50 occasions prior to the summer of 1996. Although exact figures are understandably hard to come by. It is also unclear how many of the known launches during this time were Taliban, or originated from North Alliance forces, the only real threat to Taliban control in Afghanistan by the late 1990s. By that time, the Taliban were firmly seated in power in Kabul, and while eager to continue using Scuds, what few remaining vehicles and missiles were left were in such a poor condition that they were often more of a threat to their would-be operators than anyone else. Nevertheless, the fact that the Taliban had access to them afforded them a useful bargaining chip when dealing with their neighbors. Pakistan was now an ally to Afghanistan under the Taliban, but relations with Iran soured quickly, particularly when on August 8, 1998, 10 Iranian diplomats and a journalist were murdered in the Iranian consulate at Mazar-e-Sharif after the city was captured by the Taliban. With Iran threatening to invade Afghanistan, the Taliban countered with threats to fire Scuds into Iranian territory, although just how feasible that would have been is unknown. When US and NATO forces invaded the country on October 7, 2001, following the Taliban's support for Osama bin Laden in the wake of the 9/11 atrocities, no Scuds were fired in response, although during their subsequent ongoing operations, the last known functioning launchers were dismantled by US forces in 2005. On September 15, 2021, following the Taliban's return to power, images emerged of Taliban forces examining several Scuds, apparently having been stored in the open air for decades. The weapons were in an extremely poor state, and it is highly unlikely they will be of any use to the new Taliban. But this discovery does serve as a warning concerning the countless advanced weapons hidden around the world, and just whose hands they might one day fall into, if not properly secured. And there you have the tale of Afghanistan's Scud War. Please leave a comment down below with your own thoughts and reactions, and remember to like this video and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.